electrical, yeah. Tell us about that, because I know we've got some issues with Stab-Lok.
Yeah. So
tell us a little bit about that. We got to watch out aluminum wiring, right?
So aluminum wiring, I would be more concerned about Stab-Lok than aluminum wiring, because Stab-Lok is a brand of panel. It's the manufacturer is Federal Pacific Electric Company, so that you call them Federal Pacific. But Stab-Lok was a very popular brand, you know, like a Toyota Camry, Honda Accord. So this was their model that they used, Stab-Lok, from the late 70s to the mid 80s. And they were the #1 manufacturer of these panels, so the equipment for the country. So you'll be surprised you find them all over these, you know, mid 70s to mid 1980s properties. And the problem with them are that the electrical bus on the back of it can overheat, which is a problem. So the actual main bus goes out, and then the breakers themselves fail to switch when you have an overcurrent situation. So you say you have a 20 amp breaker and you're to one of your appliances, and the breaker doesn't actually switch until you have 50, 75, even 100 amps, right? So you're in a short condition. That means the fire could have already started before a breaker is actually supposed to trip. So insurance companies don't like those. We used to, a few years ago, do a load test where you can actually put a load on those breakers and see if they would switch. But to be honest, so many of them failed, because that's like a $2,000 test. You got to bring an electrician out with a big load gear, but it's cheaper than changing out all your panels, though, right? So that's you think that's a trade-off. But then so many of those failed, and you could actually measure that it was, you know, the 20 amp breaker didn't switch until 75 amps. That we don't do that as much. Also, insurance companies, especially larger portfolio companies, are being more restrictive on those type of panels, that if they even see it, they don't want it in their portfolio. So particularly the last 2 years, they've been more restrictive on, this is something that's going to be a required repair. So I own a property, so it sounds pretty good. Well, you said I have 60 million in properties. It's 2 big properties. So when I started out with big numbers, just because I'm used to working on larger properties. And so I have one property that's 310 units, and another is 362 units. And the 362 units all had Federal Pacific panels. So this was something that we budgeted right from the beginning to change those out. Now, cost, everybody's concerned about cost. So I have a range of people here. So California prices are different than Texas prices, different than, you know, Chicago prices. But here's my recommendation. Get a commercial or a multifamily electrician to price the panel change out if you come across this, because you don't want residential pricing. You want an electrician that does a lot of these and is able to do this, you know, with a crew of people.
That was a golden nugget. That was a golden nugget. Everybody, if you're sleeping, that was a golden nugget. Make sure you write that down. Go ahead, Bryan.
Because the prices have ranged from even $2,000 per panel to what I get is about $550 per panel. Okay, so that is a huge range, right? It's a deal killer range. So I would look at, so on my side, I have $550 for a lot of panels, like 300 panels, to about $750. If you go over $1,000, I would shop around for another electrician. Just someone who has the capacity, that has the connections with enough suppliers to get that material cost down. So that's a big issue on electrical. And you mentioned aluminum wiring. So aluminum wiring has been installed since 1965 to about 1973. So you're surprised how many, well, we deal with B and C class properties a lot. So they happen to fall right in there. And so we deal with this often when we're trying to upgrade a property and we have aluminum wiring. Now, aluminum wiring by itself doesn't necessarily cause problems. Like today's larger buildings and even maybe your home, if it's a larger gauge wire, it's a larger gauge, aluminum wire is not a problem. It's the small gauge wire that goes from the switches and plugs. So that's where you're trying to mitigate, to make sure that there's no sparking in those switches and plugs. And so what's happened? Why is aluminum a problem? Because when it you know, all metals corrode or oxidize. When aluminum oxidizes, it turns green and has a little bit of oxidation on it, and it's not conductive. So you start having sparking. When copper oxidizes, the oxidation is still conductive, so you don't have the sparking. So that's one thing. And then if you do this a lot to aluminum wiring, it'll break. So then you also have weak spots. And so when you do a lot of repairs or you work on the switches and plug wiring a lot, that can cause shorts as well. So real quick, how do you fix it? So you don't change, you don't rewire. So don't go to rewire the whole apartment, but you do need to correct your switches and plugs. And so they have these things called Kolar devices, copper to aluminum retrofit, C-O-A-L-R, but they pronounce it Kolar, C-O-A-L-R for copper and aluminum, and R's for the retrofit. And so that was the standard, that those devices, they can have aluminum on one side and copper on the other. So that's one way. And then an even better way is Alumicon connectors. So Alumicon. And so then they have a competitor, it's Copalum. So depending on where you are in the country, you either have Alumicon connectors or Copalum crimping. So these completely isolate the copper and aluminum wires, because what you end up doing is having a copper device connected to the aluminum wire in the wall. So you want that transition to have no heat conductivity. All right. How much does all this cost?
Thank you.
So you typically have about 20 to 25 devices in an average apartment unit. And Kolar costs about $15 a device to do. Alumicon or Copalum are similarly priced, and they're about $23 to $25 a device. You see that that's a lot more expensive. But really, insurance companies are pushing for that. So if you have a large property, I would multiply your unit count by about 23 to 25 to get your device count. And then another, if you're able to use Kolar, $15 a device to about $25 a device. So fortunately, this does add up. So my first property I bought, I knew it was aluminum as well, because it's 1966 in phase 1 and 1967 in phase 2. And we changed all the aluminum out because I'm also an investor. So here's a tip for investors. You want to make your property as easy to sell as possible. Mm-hmm. So you want to make Julie's job easy, that she's able to finance the new buyer, and you don't want to have insurance problems. And so my goal when I'm acquire a property, I try to make it as easy as possible to be able to be sold.